It's strange to look back on my family and try to piece together where things went wrong. It feels like looking at an old, faded photograph. I still remember when it was just me and Mom. I was her everything, and she was mine. I'd sit on her lap in the mornings, still in pajamas, as she brushed my hair and hummed softly, her touch warm and soft, like a security blanket. I clung to those moments. I suppose I still do, in a way, though they're harder to remember. When I was 9, things changed. My parents got divorced, though they didn't tell me why. I was only a kid, and all I knew was that Dad was gone. He moved to a different state, and his phone calls grew fewer with each passing year. My heart hurt, but I was a kid. I adapted. I told myself it was okay because Mom and I still had each other. And then, Jim came along. I remember meeting him for the first time. Tall, quiet, with a calm seriousness in his eyes. He wasn't unkind, just distant. I thought it was because he didn't know how to talk to me. A young girl, I believed, as I often did, that everything would work out in time. That maybe I just needed to give him a chance. Jim moved in, and he brought his own way of doing things. Little routines that shifted the balance in our home. He liked things neat, ordered. Suddenly, I was expected to pick up after myself in ways I hadn't before. And there were more rules. Mom changed, too. She became quieter, focused more on keeping Jim happy than keeping me close. The years passed, and I settled into my role as the quiet, dutiful daughter. I thought maybe this was just how things worked, how families evolved. But then came the day Mom sat me down with a nervous smile and told me she was pregnant. I'll admit, I was both excited and terrified. A baby, the idea of having a sibling was thrilling, but it was hard to ignore the small voice inside me that whispered things might never be the same. As Mom's belly grew, I watched her transform before my eyes. She was a different person, happier, more vibrant. She and Jim seemed closer than ever, sharing little glances that made me feel like an outsider in my own home. When they found out it was going to be a girl, they painted the spare room a soft pink and filled it with stuffed animals and tiny clothes. Mom would spend hours folding baby blankets, humming to herself. Jim seemed to soften in a way I'd never seen, his eyes lighting up whenever he spoke about the baby. For them, it was a fresh start, a chance to build a real family. I wondered if I still counted as part of that picture. When my half-sister, Emily, was born, it was like my world shifted on its axis. She was beautiful, with soft curls and bright blue eyes that seemed to hold the universe. Mom and Jim were overjoyed, and I was, too, at least at first. I held her in my arms and promised her I'd always look out for her. But almost immediately, I could feel myself fading into the background. Mom and Jim were consumed by Emily, caught up in the wonder of their perfect little family. I'd watch them, feeling like I was observing from a distance. They'd laugh and COO at Emily, sharing in her tiny milestones. And all I could do was stand there, trying to figure out where I fit in this new picture. One night, I asked Mom if she could tuck me in like she used to. Just for a few minutes. She looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Honey, I'm busy with Emily now. Can't you see I'm needed here?" I'd never felt so invisible. At first, the changes were small, almost unnoticeable. Jim started making comments, little reminders that I should be thinking about my future, about finding a job or maybe even moving out when I graduated. I was only 17, and the idea of leaving home was terrifying. But I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just worried about money, or maybe he wanted more space for Emily. But the hints became more pointed, less subtle. I'd overhear them talking late at night. Words like real family slipping into their conversations. It was as though I was just an afterthought, an extra they had to tolerate until they didn't have to anymore. The final blow came one evening at dinner. Jim looked at me with that steady gaze, the same one he used to give Emily when she was being fussy, and said, "It's time for you to start planning your future. You're nearly an adult now." I looked at Mom, expecting her to say something, to defend me, but she only nodded, her face blank. "We need space," she said softly. "Now that we have Emily, we're building something new. A real family. I'm sure you understand." It felt like the ground was being pulled out from under me. I packed that night, tears blurring my vision as I stuffed my belongings into an old suitcase. The walls of my room, once covered with posters and photos, felt like they were closing in. By morning, I was gone. I remember walking away from that house, my suitcase dragging behind me like an anchor. I felt hollow, like something vital had been ripped out of me. The air was thick with an awful silence, broken only by the crunch of my shoes on the gravel. This was the house I'd grown up in, the place I'd once called home. But now, it was just a shell, filled with memories that no longer felt like mine. I found myself wandering the streets, unsure where to go. Who to turn to? Friends' houses seemed like an option. But the thought of explaining my situation was unbearable. How could I admit that my own family had chosen to leave me behind? It felt like a mark of shame. A wound I didn't want to expose to the world. So, I ended up at a cheap motel. The kind with flickering neon signs and worn-down carpets. I spent that first night lying on a scratchy bedspread, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. How could a mother turn her back on her own child? How could they look at me and see nothing more than an inconvenience? That night was the longest of my life. Every sound seemed to echo in the tiny room, the hum of the air conditioner, the distant murmur of voices in the hallway. I felt small, adrift in a world that suddenly seemed vast and uncaring. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. I lay there, wide awake, wondering if this was how things were supposed to be. There's a certain kind of loneliness that words can't touch, a feeling that burrows deep into your bones and makes you question everything you thought you knew. I wondered if I was broken somehow, if I'd done something to deserve this. When morning finally came, it didn't bring any relief, only a dull ache that settled into my chest, a constant reminder of the life I'd lost. The next few weeks were a blur of cold, grey mornings and endless job applications. I found work as a cashier at a grocery store, the kind of place where people pass by without really seeing you. I'd stand there for hours, scanning groceries, my hands moving automatically while my mind drifted. The days bled into each other, one shift blending into the next. I became invisible, a ghost moving through the world, unnoticed and unneeded. Money was tight. I scraped by, rationing meals and counting every penny. I spent most nights alone in my motel room, the walls closing in around me, reminding me of all the ways I didn't belong. The loneliness was suffocating, a constant weight pressing down on my chest. Yet, somehow, I kept going. There was a small part of me that refused to give up. That clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things would get better. There were days when I felt like I was floating through life, numb and detached, just going through the motions. The store became a kind of refuge. The rhythmic beeping of the scanner a small comfort. People passed by in blurs, faces blending together. They were strangers, moving in and out of my life without a trace. Then one day, as I rang up the groceries for a petite older woman with silver hair, she looked at me with soft eyes that felt somehow familiar, comforting. She noticed my tired smile, the way I barely looked up. "You look like you could use a little break, sweetheart," she said gently, handing me her cash. There was something in her voice, kindness, warmth, things I hadn't felt in what felt like a lifetime. I nodded, muttering a thank you, but my voice cracked. She noticed, her brow furrowed with concern, and before I knew it, she had invited me out for coffee. I didn't know why I accepted. Maybe it was the loneliness, the need to feel noticed, even if only for a few minutes. We walked to the diner next door, and she treated me to a hot cup of coffee and a slice of pie. I could barely speak, but she didn't push. She just sat there, a quiet, gentle presence, her eyes warm and understanding. Her name was Eileen, and for some reason, she reminded me of the mother I once knew. Before everything changed, in the weeks that followed, Eileen became a fixture in my life. She'd stop by the store regularly, sometimes just to chat, sometimes with little treats or words of encouragement. She didn't pry into my life, but she made it clear that if I ever needed someone to talk to, she was there. Her presence became a lifeline, a reminder that not everyone in the world was as cold and detached as the family that had left me behind. With Eileen's quiet support, I began to feel a glimmer of strength returning. The loneliness still lingered, but it didn't weigh as heavily. Slowly, I started spending more time drawing, rediscovering an old love that I'd nearly forgotten. I had always loved art, but somewhere along the way, I had let it slip through my fingers, overshadowed by the struggles of family and survival. I bought a cheap sketchpad and a few pencils, filling the pages with small drawings, quiet landscapes, faces from memory, little scenes from my life. Each stroke of the pencil was a release, a way to make sense of the emotions that churned inside me. Art became my escape, a place where I could find peace, even if only for a few minutes at a time. One day, while flipping through an old sketchbook, I found a drawing I had made of my mother. She was smiling, her eyes bright and full of life, looking at me like I was the most important person in the world. Seeing it felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of what I had lost. But instead of putting it away, I let myself feel the sadness, the anger, the confusion. I allowed myself to grieve the family I would never have again. Over time, my art grew bolder, more expressive. I was no longer just filling pages, I was creating something that felt like a part of me. It was as if each line, each shadow, was a piece of my story, a testament to the pain I had endured and the strength I was slowly finding. It had been months since I'd last seen my mother or Jim. Part of me believed that I could go the rest of my life without running into them. That the past would stay firmly behind me. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. One afternoon, as I was leaving work, I saw them. They were standing across the street, hand in hand, with Emily toddling between them, her little fingers wrapped around Mom's. They looked like the perfect family, a happy trio, smiling and laughing, oblivious to the world around them. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I felt like a child again, desperate for my mother's approval, longing to be a part of their world. But as I stood there, something shifted inside me. I realized that I didn't need their approval. I didn't need to be part of the real family. I was building my own life, one that didn't revolve around people who had chosen to leave me behind. I turned and walked away, my heart heavy but resolute. That encounter hurt, but it also set me free. I knew then that I was done waiting for them to see me, to care about me. I didn't need them anymore. My art had always been a private thing, a way to express the emotions I couldn't put into words. But one evening, as Eileen and I sat together at the diner, she asked to see my sketchbook. I hesitated, but there was something in her eyes, a gentle encouragement that gave me the courage to share my work with her. She flipped through the pages slowly, taking in each drawing with quiet appreciation. When she reached the end, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with pride. "You have a gift, sweetheart," she said softly. "You shouldn't hide it away." She told me about a local gallery that hosted exhibits for emerging artists, encouraging me to submit my work. At first, I laughed at the idea. Me, an artist? But Eileen's faith in me was unwavering. Slowly, her belief in my talent began to chip away at my self-doubt. I spent weeks preparing, pouring my heart into each piece, telling my story through lines and colors. When the day of the exhibit finally arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. But Eileen was there by my side, her hand resting on my shoulder as she gave me one last encouraging smile. The exhibit was modest, but it was mine. People wandered through, studying my art, and for the first time in my life, I felt seen not as someone's daughter or someone's burden, but as an individual with a story to tell. That night, I went home with a sense of pride I had never felt before. I was no longer the invisible girl from a broken family. I was an artist, a survivor, someone who had found her own way forward. In the weeks that followed, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was finally living for myself, no longer haunted by the shadows of my past. I realized that the pain of my family's abandonment would always be a part of me. But it didn't have to define me. One evening, I sat down to write a letter to my mother. I didn't know if I'd ever send it, but I needed to put my feelings into words, to release the emotions that had been festering inside me for so long. In the letter, I told her about the hurt, the loneliness, the betrayal. I told her about the nights I spent in that tiny motel room, wondering if I was worth anything to anyone. But I also told her about the kindness I'd found, the strength I'd discovered within myself, the art that had given me a voice. I forgave her not for her sake, but for mine. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I didn't need her response. I didn't need her to apologize or make amends. I had given myself closure, and that was enough. As I walked outside that night, looking up at the stars, I felt a quiet sense of peace. I was free from the past, free to build a life of my own. I didn't need anyone's approval or acceptance. I was enough, just as I was. Months later, I opened a small art studio with the money I had saved from my job and the modest success of my art exhibit. I taught classes to local kids and created a space where people could express themselves. Just as I had, my past was still a part of me, but it no longer weighed me down. Instead, it served as a reminder of how far I had come. And as I watched those kids draw and paint, I felt a sense of joy that went beyond words. I was no longer defined by what I had lost but by what I had found: strength, resilience, and a life of my own making.